Next on our schedule is Hance Haney. Hance Haney is Director and Senior Fellow of the Technology and Democracy Project at the Discovery Institute in Washington, D.C. I will get that right. He is the co-author, along with George Gilder, of the 10 Principles of Telecom Reform publication. And many of you have already grabbed that publication. There's also additional copies on the back desk there. And it's a very good reference, especially for our legislators, to get the principles of telecom reform in a very concise manner very quickly. And it's a good read, but it also has references to other studies that you can go further in depth and explore the issue even further. Hance's topic today closely follows that document, 10 Principles of Telecommunications. Please join me in welcoming Hance Haney to the podium. Did you need PowerPoint?
Good morning. Senator Hirschman talked about how Indiana's telecommunications regulation had been drafted for a different world. And I'd like to begin my remarks by talking about why telecommunications reform. Well, the world that he's describing is a world that was characterized by copper wires and mechanical switches. And of course, a transformation has been occurring. We now live in a world of fiber optics, routers, cell phones, and internet teleputers. A wave of competition has engulfed the industry. Voice over cable IP, for example, is available to 97 million households. That's almost every household in America. And almost 15 million are taking that service now. A third of the nation's households are relying either exclusively on a cell phone or primarily on a cell phone as their exclusive or primary communications device. And 35 million cell phone subscribers actually receive a broadband data service over their cell phone. Now, it's defined as 200 kilobits per second in one direction, which of course is extremely small, but the major carriers have completed a third generation network upgrade, which is providing, let's say, 400 to 800 kilobits per second, and is now preparing to embark upon a fourth generation upgrade that's going to initially provide speeds comparable to DSL, but can provide speeds ultimately that are much higher than that. One study projects that by the year 2012, the incumbent telecommunications providers are going to be left with a 51% market share. That by that year, we'll have 26 million cell phone subscribers who rely exclusively on their cell phones, and that doesn't count those who will rely primarily on them to make long-distance calls and so forth. And then over 30 million consumers will be utilizing cable voice over IP. So it's safe to say, and here I'd like to quote Alfred Kahn, who was President Jimmy Carter's chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board, previously had been chairman of the New York Public Service Commission, professor of economics at Cornell, still a leading expert in this area, who says, obviously, the industry is no longer a natural monopoly. Now, we have a lot of historical precedent. I mean, this is the point, this is beyond the point, actually, where we do deregulate. And I'd like to cite specifically the example of wireless in 1993. President Clinton came to office, and his major legislation, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993, was passed by Vice President Al Gore's tie-breaking Senate vote. Completely deregulated the wireless industry. Now, at that time, there were 2 cell phone providers in each market, and part of what that legislation did was open up new spectrum so that there could be 4 PCS competitors. PCS at the time was a slightly different technology, but cellular and PCS now are virtually indistinguishable. And at that time, Congress completely deregulated the market without waiting for the PCS providers who at that point hadn't even bid on the spectrum. We didn't even know who they would be. We weren't even sure they were going to bid on the spectrum. That was without even waiting for them to become established in the market and to actually acquire a certain market share. That happened because nobody felt threatened by wireless. Most industry experts at the time simply never foresaw that wireless would become a major competitor to wireline telephone service. A few years later, in 1996, Congress completely deregulated cable pricing regulation. And the reason for that was because it had deregulated in 1984, wasn't happy with the results, so it re-regulated in 1992. That led to disaster, and so in 1996, it completely deregulated cable. At that point began a $130 billion investment in upgrading their networks, which is to provide broadband service. It was a direct result of the availability of new technology and the elimination of regulation, which would have otherwise created uncertainty for investors. In March of 1996, Indiana passed what we consider the most comprehensive, boldest legislation. Senator Hirschman was the sponsor, and Governor Mitch Daniels was supportive. And this legislation contains many key elements that we commend to you as items that should be included in a comprehensive deregulatory framework. Now, Ohio has already taken some very important steps. For example, it has established that VoIP services will not be subject to utility-type regulation. It's reformed its tax structure, streamlined and evened out the taxes that are applicable to communications providers, and other important reforms. And I'll cite some of those as we go through these. But we're also recommending complete pricing freedom, complete de-tariffing, establishing that broadband services will not be subject to regulation, transferring responsibility for consumer protection to whatever central state authority already exists, whether that be the Attorney General or a Consumer Protection Commission. In other words, whoever is responsible for protecting consumers in other competitive industries. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. So these proposals may seem extremely radical to those of us who are old enough to remember Ma Bell and perhaps remember watching Lily Tomlin lampoon the Bell system, and then watching the Baby Bells, who for a good 10 years or so were absolute complete monopolies in their market. But this world just simply no longer exists. Now, the reason that regulatory reform is urgent, I mean, the question arises, well, I mean, you know, these regulations, they're designed to protect consumers. How can they be harmful? And I submit to you that they are harmful. And the reason is because enormous continued investment is necessary to augment the investment that's already been made in the Internet. One study estimates that by the year 2015, the Internet will be 50 times larger than it is today. And so globally, there needs to be at least $137 billion of investment, not only in the core, but in the edge of the Internet. Another study projects that for every 1% increase in Internet adoption and use leads to 300,000 jobs nationwide. And Brian, we have a slide that shows job. Okay, is that the next one? It might be the third or fourth, but we have a slide which we've calculated what this would be in Ohio if we assumed a 7% increase based on the same methodology in this study I've just cited. Kentucky, the Connect Kentucky project, estimates that they had a 7% increase in broadband adoption. And so we've calculated what that would mean for Ohio in terms of jobs. And so the economic impact is significant.